I did it, and I will go to jail for it. I am a stalwart, and Arthur will be president.
Guiteau made it a point to let everybody know that he knew exactly what he was doing.
An assassin targeted the president because he thought he had a better chance for a job with the vice president.
The fact that he saw himself as a viable political appointee suggested that there was really something rotten in the system, even more than people understood.
Most Americans didn't know anything about the vice president. Most Americans didn't know about Chester Arthur. So their first introduction was that the assassin essentially says, "Hey, I'm an Arthur guy."
It raised the question, as this was reported quite widely, well, did Chester Arthur have anything to do with this?
He had become vice president and was placed on the ticket for purely political reasons. And yet here he was on the threshold of the presidency.
He was somebody that was essentially a lackey to a party boss, a machine boss.
There's a lot of things happening in America in the 1880s, and Chester Arthur just simply was not prepared to be a real leader at that point in time.
He knows public sentiment is not on his side.
I think you could argue this is one of the worst times of his life. And so I think in that situation, as any human would need, Arthur needed encouragement.
People call you a shrewd politician. Does that satisfy you? My ambition for you is larger. The great tidal wave of sorrow, which has rolled over the country, has swept you loose from your old moorings and set you on a mountaintop, alone, as President of the United States, made such by no election, but by a national calamity. You have no old associations, no personal friends, no political ties. You have only your duty to the people at large. You are free, free to be as able and as honorable as any man who ever filled the presidential chair. You have a great responsibility resting on you, but you will prove equal to it.
By the late 1800s, the tenor of our government had changed entirely from the founding era. Washington was growing quickly after the war. Bureaucracies had taken root. The way things got done was through patronage and the spoils system, and that meant both policies that were determined and the personnel selected to work in our government. And no one exemplified this more than Chester Arthur.
Chester Arthur was a man of the machine. In essence, he made it a point to be an ally of certain key people in order to rise to the top. That's how he got his positions of power. That's how he was able to make a name for himself.
He compromised his principles and his ethics and his morals in pursuit of his ambition. He came to New York City, as many people did then and do now, sort of an ambitious young lawyer looking to make his way in the world. He was involved in a case that desegregated the New York City streetcars.
At this time of the Civil War, he becomes a brigadier general in the New York National Guard, and he actually does yeoman service, really good service, all behind the scenes in the Civil War. He's a quartermaster general, an inspector general, very efficient, very disciplined, very likable, and through that, he makes a lot of political connections.
Roscoe Conkling was the boss of the Republican Party in New York State. He was a very flamboyant, interesting character in his own right, known as a terrific speaker, one of the best speakers in Congress. But Roscoe Conkling was also known as a politician who didn't really like people very much, which was kind of strange for a person in his line of work. Arthur was the opposite kind of a person.
He was jovial, he was fun to be around, he liked nothing better than staying up till the wee hours of the morning with people, telling stories and smoking cigars, having drinks, and really, again, doing whatever the boss wanted to help the machine move forward.
The spoils system basically says that you're winning more than just the privilege of serving the American people. If you win the White House, if you win the governor's mansion, if you win a prominent political office, it's more than just getting policies through. It's also helping friends. It's also enriching oneself.
And that, of course, is one of the most important things to keep the political machine going, is the ability to hand out jobs to your supporters and also to collect campaign contributions from those supporters.
Part of that was him getting one of these patronage jobs himself. In fact, it's the plum patronage job in the entire country, the collector at the Port of New York. About 2/3 of the revenue for the federal government at the time came through the Port of New York because there was no income tax at the time. It was all based on tariffs.
Now, as part of your job as collector, you were entitled, whenever you levied a penalty on someone for not paying the proper tax, you could take a cut. But then in addition to that, Arthur and his cronies in the custom house played fast and loose with those rules and ended up taking more money than they were entitled to. Sometimes when your goods arrived in port, they had to be stored for a while in a warehouse, and items mysteriously disappeared from the warehouse. So there are all kinds of ways that he was able to enrich himself and engage in corruption.
Through being able to manipulate, being in that seat of power, was able to make more money than the President of the United States did at that point of time.
And this in addition to the fact, of course, that it was this vast source of patronage jobs, and he was handing out jobs to loyal Republicans who may or may not have been qualified for the jobs that they were hired to do.
Arthur was so scandalous, corrupt, that President Hayes was compelled to do something about this. The problem presented to him is something familiar to us today. Removing a government employee is nearly impossible. It's technically difficult, it's time-consuming, and it's politically costly. President Hayes had to be willing to go to war with Senator Conkling in order to remove Chester Arthur.
Congress goes into recess, and now Hayes takes the opportunity to suspend Arthur and replace him temporarily with a guy named Edwin Merritt. And when the Senate comes back, there were more Democrats now in the Senate, but mostly people were kind of sick and tired of Roscoe Conkling telling them what to do. And Arthur is finally out as the collector. It takes over a year to fire him, but that's how he eventually loses his job as the collector at the Port of New York.
In 1880, a couple years after losing his position, Chester Arthur lost his wife. She unexpectedly died at the young age of 42, but he wasn't given time to mourn. In fact, the Republican Party was at an inflection point. The question was, would the government benefit politicians and office holders, or everyone? And Senator Conkling needed Arthur by his side. They were headed to Chicago for the National Convention, and these men were determined to find a nominee who would stand for the spoils system.
Back in earlier times in these presidential elections, you don't have a national convention where people come in and the delegates are already spoken for. You have a lot of backroom deals. You're trying to balance a ticket geographically, and you're trying to make sure that you can eventually have enough electoral votes to win the presidency.
Roscoe Conkling and the machine, they were backing Grant, the former president, to serve what would have been an unheard of third term. The reason they loved Grant so much was not because he was a Civil War hero, it was because his second term had been rife with corruption and they had profited. But while there was a lot of support for Grant, there wasn't quite enough to get him over the top in terms of the balloting. So the Republicans went around and around and around, multiple ballots, north of 30 ballots deadlocked. And then finally, they arrived at a compromise choice, a so-called dark horse candidate who hadn't really been considered before the convention, and that was James Garfield.
Garfield was what they called a half-breed. In essence, that term comes from he was a Republican, but not the type of Republican that the stalwarts wanted.
James Garfield was precisely the sort of man that Conkling did not want to get the nomination. He was not in favor of a system built on favoritism and patronage. He thought it was most important to give jobs to people who earned them, not only because they would do a better job, but it would result in better outcomes for the American people.
The leaders of the party are continuing to say, we need New York, we need Conkling, what are we going to do? And so they say for the vice president, we'll go find one of Conkling's people to put up for the vice presidency. That'll get Conkling to support us in the campaign and be able to win New York, we'll win the presidency. How about Chester Arthur? Again, Arthur's name kind of out of the blue. He'd never held political office before. Nobody knew what he stood for, but he was one of the top lieutenants of Conkling, and everybody liked him. He was a very likable fellow. So let's make him the vice president. They were not thinking of the presidency at all or competence for the presidency. This was all about winning the election. To win the election, they needed New York.
And so by taking the stalwarts, who were the Arthur wing of the Republican Party, the people that were looking for the spoils of war, but also Garfield, that was an opportunity to bring the party together, unite them in such a way where they can go win the 1880 election, while at the same exact time neutralizing Chester Arthur as somebody that had a reputation of being corrupt, but in the vice presidency role, didn't have much power to do anything about it.
There is no place in which his powers of mischief will be so small as in the vice presidency, and it will remove him during a great part of the year from his own field of activity. It is true General Garfield, if elected, may die during his term of office, but this is too unlikely a contingency to be worth making extraordinary provision for.
Chester Arthur and James Garfield barely knew each other. When we think of the vice president now, we think of somebody that's part of the administration, that's part of the team.
In this case, Arthur and the President Garfield were actually very much at odds, because Chester Arthur, as Vice President of the United States, thought of his boss was Roscoe Conkling, and Conkling and Garfield were at loggerheads over patronage.
The machine in New York needed the Custom House and the Custom House jobs to perpetuate itself. And therefore, the senators from New York, namely Roscoe Conkling, were supposed to be the ones who were in charge of deciding who the collector would be. Now, Garfield, though, enraged the stalwarts by picking someone as collector who was not a member of the machine. And so Conkling and the other New York senator, to protest this decision, decided to resign their seats in the Senate. Now, this was before the direct election of senators, state legislatures elected senators, and they felt that this would send a signal to Garfield about how unhappy they were and how inappropriate it was that they hadn't consulted them. And their idea was, we're going to create this drama, we're going to resign our seats, and the New York legislature will very quickly re-elect us. Didn't turn out that way. And so Arthur went up to Albany, even though he was vice president, Garfield's vice president, and went up there to try and help Conkling and Platt get their seats back. So he was basically, as vice president of the United States, in direct conflict with the president, Garfield.
Guiteau is an office seeker. He wants a job in the administration, and he has convinced himself that he deserves not only a job, but a really good job.
And Guiteau, although he was not a man of immense talent or even immense connections as far as network, he felt entitled to being able to be part of that system.
But he also had a very dangerous combination. He was somebody who couldn't get his act together in life, but also had delusions of grandeur.
He actually gets an audience with Garfield for a couple of minutes. He shows him this speech that he wrote. He then starts badgering James Blaine, the Secretary of State. He wants this ambassadorship, and eventually Blaine says, "Enough of you, I don't want to see you anymore. We're not going to talk about this." And at that point, Guiteau is miffed. He's angry.
The longer he felt that he was on the outside looking in or not given the respect he deserved, the more he felt that he was going to do something about it.
He came to the belief that he had to assassinate President Garfield. So Garfield arrived at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad station. Charles Guiteau approached him from behind and fired 2 shots point blank at Garfield.
And then Garfield crumples to the ground, through James Blaine's hand.
He also said, "I'm a stalwart, and Chester Arthur will be president."
And people have to remember that Garfield did not die like Lincoln the next day. It took him weeks upon weeks to succumb to his injuries. This had an opportunity to weigh on Chester Arthur over time. It also had the opportunity to weigh on the American people in regards to what would a Chester Arthur administration mean?
Arthur was accused by many people of having contributed, perhaps even having been part of the plot. He was overwhelmed with the possibility of becoming President of the United States, for which he and many, many others, judging from the newspapers, thought he was wholly unqualified.
Arthur was absolutely devastated by this. He actually was a fairly sensitive man, and observers throughout that summer remarked about how he always looked teary or like he had been crying, his eyes were bloodshot.
He didn't want to be president at all. In fact, the notion terrified him. He loved the idea about being vice president. He thought that would be very ceremonial. There's really no responsibility at the time.
So he was in a very vulnerable place when he received this letter from this mysterious young woman in New York.
To the Honorable Chester A. Arthur, the hours of Garfield's life are numbered. Before this meets your eye, you may be president. The people are bowed in grief, but do you realize it? not so much because he is dying, as because you are his successor. The day he was shot, the thought rose in 1,000 minds that you might be the instigator of the foul act. Is not that a humiliation which cuts deeper than any bullet can pierce? Your best friend said, Arthur must resign. He cannot accept office with such a suspicion resting upon him. And now your kindest opponents say, Arthur will try to do right, adding gloomily, he won't succeed though. Making a man president cannot change him. But making a man president can change him. Great emergencies awaken generous traits which have lain dormant half a life. If there is a spark of true nobility in you, now is the occasion to let it shine. Faith in your better nature forces me to write to you, but not to beg you to resign. Do what is more difficult and more brave. Reform. Rise to the emergency. Disappoint our fears. Force the nation to have faith in you. Yours respectfully, Julia I. Sand.
So it's this very extraordinary, fairly long letter.
The whole first page of the letter is sort of almost damning Arthur, and then she pivots and she talks about uplifting him.
She says, I understand what's going on, and public sentiment is not behind you because they think you're of the political machine, and you are of the political machine, but this is your opportunity to reform and to change.
And she's really then trying to build him up to be a person that he has never been. She uses these sort of bold statements to try to shock him into thinking, you're going to be president, and everyone has a really low expectation of you. Time to surprise them.
She really seems to capture his sort of internal state at the time, and I think it really moved him, that letter.
Julia Sand has a very interesting background. First of all, she came from an immigrant family, so you have the family that left everything to come here to the United States and build a new life.
She was the youngest of 8 children. Her father had been a German immigrant, and her mother was a native-born American. We know that she had a brother who was killed in the Civil War. She was also an unmarried woman. When she started writing to Arthur, she was about 31. She was very literary. She liked to paint. She actually produced articles that were published in periodicals, maybe not necessarily under her own name. She liked poetry. She could speak French.
And she was somebody that was not afraid to speak her mind. She was also very astute politically. Her family members later on said that she was somebody that could talk about politics endlessly.
And she also seems to be a very deep thinker, just in the way that she writes her letters. She's very witty. She is spending time, energy, effort, thought.
But what we also know about her is that her own world was somewhat confined. She refers to herself as an invalid, of having weakness, of having lameness. So she'll refer in her letters to some physical difficulties that she had had.
Whatever sickness she had, these symptoms were enough to keep her housebound for much of the time. So she was surely frustrated by that. And also, as I say, a political junkie. She clearly read the papers voraciously. And in a time when women were barred from participating in politics, she surely had a very keen interest in politics and was very knowledgeable about politics.
Where her physical circumstances might have been somewhat limited, her mind was very expansive.
She's living in the family home. The family's basically taking care of her. She understands the way of the world. She understands politics, but it's all informed by what she sees and reads basically within this home on 74th Street in New York City.
Julia Sand understood that there was a problem with the way the government was working. And she could see from New York that the will to solve this problem, it was not going to come from within Washington. Keep in mind, this is a single woman in an era when women could not even vote. She was still willing to use the power that she held as a citizen to do what she could to change the direction of our government. Her second letter arrived just when it was needed most. This is the point when Garfield died of his wounds and Chester Arthur was at his lowest moment.
Arthur is just overcome. I think he's fearful that the country is continuing to blame him for what happened. He's overwhelmed by the prospect of becoming president and the responsibilities that will fall on him. And so when he receives news that Garfield has finally died, he sort of collapses in tears. puts his head down on the table and sobs.
And so Garfield is really dead. And you are president. For a time, it seemed as if we all were mistaken, as if he meant to disappoint our fears. My only excuse for this letter is the deep sympathy I feel for you in your sorrow. All through these sad, dreary days, I have followed your name in the newspapers with the feeling that you were the chief mourner. Even contemplating the wife, the mother, the children of the departed has not changed your position. Great as their suffering is, it is what hundreds in the obscurity of private life have suffered before them. And they have those consolations which come to all who mourn for the brave and the true. But your affliction is different. What we all endured during the terrible months of anxiety just past, you too endured, intensified 10,000-fold by the reflection that you were the one human being to benefit by his death, that you had been opposed to him, that some believed you capable of having plotted for his cruel end. You were alone in your sorrow, perfectly isolated. There is consolation for sorrow like yours, though it comes slowly. You have a deeper inspiration to duty than falls to the lot of most men.
When you're somebody like Chester Arthur, you're in a system where relationships are built on utility. How can this person help me? How can I help them so they can help me? Julia Sand's letters were really refreshing in the sense that she came from a position where she didn't have anything at stake except for her desire as a citizen for her country to succeed and her president to succeed.
She refers over and over again to her having faith in him, particularly when other people don't. In the context of being a woman who doesn't have any political power or any influence within her own circle, I think this was her way of trying to encourage him to reform himself and be better.
Just from reading her letters, she tends to be more on the reform side of the Republican Party. She tends to lead toward the half-breeds, but she doesn't call herself that.
Taken at large, one branch of the Republican Party is about as good as the other. That man from Maine does not lead a band of angels any more than that man from the other place. But in the state of New York, it is different. Here, an absolute right and wrong are in conflict. Unfortunately, you have been connected with the side which represents the wrong, the machine, the thing which I politely request you to smash. If there is a soul in the Republican Party, it is on the other side. Do not thrust on the people politicians who have forfeited their respect, no matter how near they may be to you as personal friends. Appoint those only of marked ability and of sterling character. Such may not be abundant, but you will find them if you seek them.
To the victors go the spoils. Well, what bigger prize would there be than the White House in 1881 for the stalwarts?
The people elected James Garfield. Now it's going to be Chester Arthur, and everybody thought that meant Roscoe Conkling was going to run the country.
And Conkling and a lot of the New York machine thought that, wow, now one of our guys is President of the United States, we're really going to reap the benefits. Now Conkling figured, okay, Garfield had appointed this guy who was not one of us to be collector of the custom house. Now our guy's in charge. He's going to remove that person and put one of our guys in his place. Here he is basically ordering Arthur, who is now President of the United States, to replace the collector with a New York machine guy.
Chester Arthur said no, which was surprising to everybody. And I'd have to imagine that when Conkling walked out of the office, Arthur was probably surprised as well.
He says that he owed the vice presidency to Conkling, he owes the presidency to the Almighty.
But it also makes you wonder if Julia Sand's letter resonated with him as he was talking to Conkling.
There was this sense that something different was going on now, and Chester Arthur had to be different in this role entrusted to him by the American people. So Garfield's cabinet didn't want to have anything to do with Chester Arthur.
Though Arthur urged them to stay on, and he had, when he took office, pledged to continue the policies of his predecessor, many of them resigned.
Many of these men only really knew him from his political activities in New York. So Garfield's cabinet members didn't really have a reason to trust Arthur, even when he said, "I'll support civil service reform."
This was perceived among the reformers in the country as a very bad sign, that the people who were most dedicated to reform, who had been close to Garfield, were refusing to serve in the Arthur administration.
James Blaine, the Secretary of State, leaves the cabinet, creates the opening. It's the top spot in the cabinet, and Conkling's already telling people that he's going to be the next Secretary of State. Again, he will get into the cabinet, take over, and he's going to run the country like his political machine again. And Arthur tells Conkling, no, you're not going to be Secretary of State, you're not coming into my cabinet. And at that point, their relationship is basically severed. After years of Arthur being this top lieutenant and doing whatever Conkling has said, he changed in this moment of responsibility.
Then Arthur appointed people who were mostly from the stalwart faction, but again, surprised a lot of people by appointing fairly respectable, qualified men. The one person who stayed was Robert Todd Lincoln, who was Secretary of War, and probably the person in Garfield's cabinet and Arthur's cabinet who most understood the impact of a presidential assassination.
As Julia's writing letters to the president, she uses the term little dwarf to describe herself.
And she meant it in the Shakespearean context of the dwarf is the one person in the king's court who can tell the king the truth and not face any sort of repercussions.
And Julia saw herself as that to President Arthur, as someone who was willing to tell the truth and the only one who could tell the truth.
She would tell him what she thought about cabinet appointments. Basically, if she had an opinion about something, she would express it. She did not think very highly of former President Grant. She thought he was fairly useless on many levels.
Do not let the people believe that he is to influence your administration. 8 years of the presidency ought to be an education to a man, even if he knew only how to read and write before. Except an inflated impression of his own greatness, has an additional idea been rubbed into his brain? In case it has, he has kept the secret wonderfully. To him, politics means which man is to get a place, and very little else. As to real statesmanship, he has no more conception of it than has a wild elephant.
The much broader question is civil service reform that President Hayes had sort of started, got a little bit going when he fired Chester Arthur, ironically.
Civil service reform was essentially trying to make it, even in kind of baby steps initially, that you actually had to be competent and qualified for your job. That it wasn't just you'd been a loyal party person, so we'll kick the other guy out, give you a position. It had been a spoils system.
And again, the country is thinking this is a machine politician who is now in the White House. The last thing he is going to do is champion civil service reform.
He did express generally some support for civil service reform, which was surprising in and of itself, given his history. However, Congress was not in the mood to do anything about it, and he didn't push very hard for it. So, as Julia Sands said in one of her letters, people said, oh, well, this message is nice, but we don't really take it very seriously.
You've got to remember, there's a lot of people in Congress who owe their jobs to this political machine system, and so they were not ready to just jump into the game despite Garfield's assassination and that whole story.
In the political arena, you're not going to win every battle. Certainly not right away. When it comes to government reform, you have to play for the long game. You're also never fighting on just one front. Julia Sand understood that America faced a lot of problems, and she made sure that the president knew what she thought about them.
The first Chinese Exclusion Act bill would have banned Chinese immigrants from the country for 20 years, in addition to placing other restrictions on them.
It was hardly to be expected that the United States of America would take the lead in a march back to the Dark Ages. So don't sign that bill. Send it back to Congress with a message that people will remember. You might recommend an appropriation for a public school in the District of Columbia, where our honored senators and representatives might go for an hour or two a day to study history and political science.
Arthur vetoed that bill and wrote a very eloquent veto message where he talked about the bill being un-American and that it would hurt our relations.
He acknowledged that Chinese immigrants had been very important in terms of building the Transcontinental Railroad and economic activity, particularly out in the West.
And Julia Sand was thrilled
Don't you feel flattered how awfully surprised they are whenever you do anything good? Well, go on surprising them, but I am never surprised because I expect it of you.
Then the Congress came back with another bill that cut the amount of time in half, from 20 years to 10 years. And Arthur, knowing that the Congress would easily override his veto because there was very strong support for this bill, went ahead and did not veto this second version.
She wrote back and excoriated Arthur and basically said, you stood up in one regard, but you in essence were a weakling in another. You can set the course of history. Pick who you want to be.
Why do you take such comfort in half measures? Unnecessary legislation is a positive evil in any case, but this is worse, for it is contrary to the spirit of our institutions and the civilization of the age. Nothing that you can do after will obliterate your presidential record.
Julius Ann thought she was done with Chester Arthur. Arthur had lost her trust. But then she saw other actions he took. For example, he vetoed the River and Harbor Act, and she thought maybe he wasn't just serving his own narrow political interests, but there was something more to him.
The River and Harbor Bill of 1882 was a very interesting situation for Congress and the president. It started out as about a $4 million appropriations bill, and by the time it got to the president's desk, it had escalated to $19 million.
Newspaper reporters took note of the fact that this particular version of the River and Harbors bill was really filled with pork, as we would call it now. It became sort of a Christmas tree for all the congressmen who wanted to hang their pet projects on it. And at this point, some of them even directly benefited financially from the projects in there.
And he actually ends up vetoing the bill, and her brother happens to read in the paper that the bill was vetoed, and she was talking about how emotional she got.
I realized what a struggle you had passed through, what an opposition you had to stand up against in coming to your final decision. The country is proud of its president today and ashamed of its Congress. I hope you will calmly and firmly maintain the honorable and independent stand you have taken.
She was in New York and he would come to New York. And so she would drop little hints about wanting to meet him and wanting to talk over things.
Because she wasn't hearing from him at all. He had never, as far as we know, responded to any of her letters. She has no idea if he's even reading them, knows nothing. And so she just starts to wonder, is she even making a difference? Is what she's doing even helpful? And almost is down on herself for having written so many letters and not heard anything from the president as to whether or not he cared.
Well, have you not 5 minutes to spare for me when I've spared so many hours for you in this long, sad, exciting year? For a whole year, I have thought of and felt with you in your cares and perplexities. Perhaps most of my letters have never reached your eye. Possibly, at the sight of the unwelcome handwriting, you destroyed them unread.
She's literally upstairs. She hears a voice. She hears her family entertaining somebody, and she looks, and it's Chester Arthur in her home.
Well, he just showed up there unannounced.
She's sitting around with her entire family and the President of the United States. And I think her brother said she acted almost as if, having let the genie out of the bottle, she wasn't sure what to do with him and tried to put him back in.
And I think it really threw her off because family was there. She wanted to talk to the president, and in her head, she would be ready for his visit.
Then eventually, slowly, she started to get into political topics with him. At first, she was, as you might imagine, taken aback by the fact that the President of the United States was sitting in the living room.
And then the thing that was important for her and for us is he confirmed that he'd read her letters.
Chester Arthur is basically saying, I acknowledge your letters, I acknowledge your encouragement, and I am taking seriously the challenges that you are placing at my feet.
And she very eloquently describes this meeting in a subsequent letter, which is why we have the descriptions of this meeting.
Her letters show that she really thought through every step the president made in her house, the conversations he had, the eye contact he made with people, and she had thought through every single aspect of that.
He remarks to some of her family members there, you know, she expects me to be an angel, and it's difficult as a politician.
And Julia kind of meekly asks, do you forgive some of the tone that I've had in my letters? And the president says no. And to this day, we don't know if he was just kind of giving a little bit of an elbow and saying, hey, I'm here, ain't I? Or if he was serious.
So he was there for about an hour, and it wasn't quite how she in her mind envisioned it would be.
But it was through that, I think she did begin to realize he did care enough to where maybe he didn't respond to her letters, but he did show up at her house. He did show her he was listening to what she had to say.
Kind of goes back to some of the other presidential interactions we've had over history. You think about some of the civil rights leaders over the 20th century that visited presidents. There was this dynamic where there needed to be somebody that pushed that president in that story to do the right thing. And in this instance, it was Sand with Arthur.
She's his conscience in some ways. Sometimes a little naggy, but she's his conscience. And sometimes she's proven right.
The vital question before the country today is civil service reform. The vital question before you is how you will meet it. Are you a coward? Do you fear to face the same danger that Garfield faced? It is for you to choose.
The longer that Chester Arthur was the President of the United States, the more he understood the need for reform to build trust back in government.
There was this election in 1882 where the Republicans suffered pretty serious losses, and the voters made it very clear that they did support civil service reform.
People could just see the political mood of the country and realize that civil service reform was becoming more popular with Americans.
Though he had already expressed general support for civil service reform in his first annual message, after this election, in his second message, he more vehemently expressed support for it. And so a bill which had been languishing in the Congress, the Pendleton bill, which would enact many of the civil service reforms that people wanted, had new life. Lo and behold, it actually passed Congress.
And it comes with some really important elements. It's just a start. Civil service reform's still a long way to go. For some segment of those jobs, they're now going to be awarded not just based on political patronage, you had to show that you were competent.
He created a balance from a system that had gone too far in the way of party loyalty, and he restored just the principle of merit into the government.
Which also allowed for some people to come into the fold based on their talent, not on who put them in those positions of power based on politics.
Civil service reform was the crucial step because it makes it possible to change the agency so that they serve the interests of all Americans, rather than serving the interests of the people that get placed in power. You can't reform government if those in power at these agencies are there only for their self-interest.
Perhaps the most important thing, and the real test for Arthur, is it set up a civil service commission. They were actually going to put some executive branch authority into making sure that the Pendleton Act is actually implemented and implemented properly. And the president had a lot of authority in this area, and if he didn't want this thing to go very far, he easily could have, appointed people that weren't going to enforce it or, sort of make their life difficult. And he does none of that. He appoints real reformers. And according to those commissioners, Arthur did everything they asked.
The spoil system was really the method that government jobs would be filled. It was Chester Arthur who arguably was the most definitive product of that system to ever become president, to sign a bill that dealt a massive blow to that system.
Opponents have been forced to admire you. You have done better than friend or foe expected, and it is to your honor that it is so.
He turned out to be competent, to be decent, to be fair, to try to be the things that Julia wanted and others wanted him to be, as opposed to the man he had been as a political operative in New York City.
It would be hard indeed to better President Arthur's administration.
No man ever entered the presidency so profoundly and widely distrusted as Chester Alan Arthur. And no one ever retired more generally respected, alike by political friend and foe.
Chester Arthur, I think, has been underappreciated for a very long time. He's a fascinating American figure, and in a way, an American hero, a very unlikely American hero.
When we have examples like that, I think we want to communicate them to the country to know that we've had our leaders who actually take that opportunity to do the right thing.
When you start looking at the 1884 election, there's several things that come to play with Chester Arthur.
He paid a political price by being a better president, by trying to do what he thought was right, by being decent, He was not necessarily getting the coalitions together that he would have needed.
He wasn't really the favorite of the reformers, and he wasn't really trusted by the guys in the machine. So he didn't really have a natural constituency. He refused to use the tools of an incumbent president to win the nomination. I don't want the nomination if I'm going to have to promise people jobs in order to get it. So in essence, the guy whose whole career was about machine politics refused to use those tools when it came to the convention.
Other people were more interested in campaigning for the nomination, particularly James G. Blaine.
Another factor was that he had been diagnosed with Bright's disease, which was a kidney ailment, and he kept it secret. Basically, he was dying, and he knew he was dying, and he suspected that he would not be able to serve a full second term.
And as it turned out, he died in 1886. Had he actually been elected as president, he would have died partially through his term anyway.
As he was ill, he decided to take that time to really dig into his papers and decide which ones were worth keeping and which ones weren't, and also what mark in history he wanted to leave.
He asked that almost all of the documents and letters and whatnot be burned, so they filled these barrels of his documents and set them on fire.
Of all the papers that he kept, he decided to keep all the 23 letters that Julia wrote him. She signed all of her letters J.I.S., except for the first couple. He slipped them into an envelope and with his own handwriting put her initials J.I.S.
President Arthur burned most of his papers, but he had set aside and saved the letters from Julia. This leaves us with a mystery. Did he intend for us to find them? Did he want us to know about her contributions to his legacy, to his administration? If so, it's especially poignant because her life ended in tragedy.
She witnessed a friend of hers. It said she had formed an attachment to drown. We don't know the details of that. It was just a comment in a local paper.
It said that this person, a love interest, whoever it was, who had drowned several years before. So this would have been shortly after she had stopped writing to Chester Arthur.
She had witnessed his death, and that had somewhat unhinged her. They say that she had been put in what they would have called at the time an insane asylum. So from what I can tell, she basically spent the rest of her life institutionalized in some form or another.
She lived to be 83 years old, died in 1933, and she was buried in a graveyard next to her family with no marker.
All across the world, there are monuments to people who have caused great harm. Julia Sand is buried without even a marker at her gravesite. Our opportunity is to lift her up as a heroine, to carry her legacy forward, because what she did is make the government better and make the lives of all Americans better.
When we look death in the face, we are ashamed of the wretched trifles on which we have wasted our time and strength. It is by our opportunities that we will be judged. And if I could think that I had influenced you in the smallest degree, I should feel that I had not lived in vain.
At Chester Arthur II's death, his son, Chester Allen Arthur III, who went by the name Gavin inherited the papers. And he opened them up, and there were about 1,800 items in this collection. And he started looking through them, and he came across Julia Sand's letters. And he was so intrigued by these letters and their content and who this woman was that he wanted to find out more about her. He ultimately was put in touch with Julia's nephew, Paul Rosier, who had actually been at the house when Chester Arthur had come to visit. And then in 1958, the Library of Congress acquired that collection.
And she lived under many presidents, but there was something about Chester Arthur that led her to feel like she could connect with him. And that's not something that she felt towards Ulysses Grant. It's not something she felt towards Grover Cleveland.
Chester Arthur needed a Julia Sand in his corner, and he needed that person who didn't want anything from him, that wasn't angling for anything, who just wanted him to succeed and was willing to tell him the truth and persist letter after letter after letter.
She was able to read and understand and think critically and then do something.
The fact that he followed her advice on not all legislation, but on a lot of legislation, I think that all suggests that she had a very great impact on him, and therefore a significant impact on American history.
Even now, you watch a State of the Union address, you'll hear them tell stories about everyday Americans. There's a reason for that. We are always connected to our political leadership, and they're always supposed to be connected and responsive to us because of her persistence and her vision and providing just enough courage from the other side of her pen. She changed America for the better.
Julia Sand's story is an example for us all. It's the story of a woman who cared enough about the nature and shape of her government that she did something. And through her actions, big changes were made. Now it's up to us to carry on that legacy.
I have no desire to live in a little clique and hear the same opinions reiterated every day. I like to know people as different from each other as possible. In every case, I want to hear both sides. More than for anything else, I care for the truth. Yours sincerely, J.I.S.